Hello, my name is Garrett, and welcome to tonight's episode of Weird Crap That Happened in the History of New York. Tonight we're going to be talking about one of the strangest, wildest occurrences to ever befall the people of New York City. I'm talking about the police riots of June the 16th, 1857. Now, I'm not talking about riots of cops fighting criminals on the street. There's been plenty of those throughout history, and there's been plenty of that in the last year. I mean cop-on-cop violence. Now, the story doesn't actually take too long to tell, but it requires, to understand it, a certain amount of backstory, which has added to the length of this video, which is longer than what seems to be the preferred length of videos on YouTube. I guess what I'm trying to say is that I hope that you can forgive if this thing is maybe a bit paced, and if it seems a little bit amateurish, just know that I'm getting started, and that if, I get some attention or some comments, feedback from you, the viewer, that I might go the next step and put some more effort, and by that I mean financial effort, into ensuring higher quality moving forward. I don't really know exactly 100% what I'm doing. It should be understood that there's a reason why I'm telling you this story. You see, today in the United States of America, we have seen, since the Biden administration over the last 4 years, 8 million migrants have come in over the border. 100,000 have settled in New York, and we're already at our wits' end, and that's just 100,000. Now, with that many people coming into America, in fact, last year, that's more than were born. More migrants came over the border than there were American babies born in the last year. And it begs the question, a question that has been asked on many other occasions throughout our history: what exactly does it mean to be an American? And that's a valid question. Now, throughout history, with legal migration, you have to demonstrate that you understand the meaning of our Constitution. You have to demonstrate knowledge of our history, of customs, of laws, that kind of stuff. I mean, you might wonder how many of the people that have come in over the border even know who George Washington is. That might sound like a triviality, but these things actually do matter. Now, this is not something that is unique to our time. That isn't. You see, the story that I'm going to tell you takes place in the 1850s. A time that, if you were to examine with a microscope, you would find striking similarities to the era that we're living in today. And that was an era that precipitated a civil war. I just want you, as you watch, to look with your own eyes and try to draw comparisons between the time of the story and the time that you live today. If, of course, you're watching in 2024 and not 20 years from now or something, and it's all ancient history. But whatever. Anyway, I've been going on for too long. So with no further ado, I give you the police riots of 1857. I'll see you on the other side. To understand the conditions that led to the all-out cop-on-cop riot of June the 16th, 1857, we must first step further backward to December of 1835, to the aftermath of a fire. It is often forgotten that the greatest leap forward in New York City's history came on the heels of disaster. What had been the most ascendant economy in all of the United States was at once dashed to smoldering ruins. But not a minute was wasted. Not a human mind nor set of hands was without purpose in the effort to revive New York's disrupted economy, like a million ants scurrying to put their colony back together after the trampling of a rogue boot. Loans were acquired, new building codes enacted, wider streets laid out. A bigger, better city was now possible, and the most ambitious souls of a young nation would see to its ascendance. Most consequential of all in the frenzy of planning and rebuilding was that by 1842 the Irish-built Croton Aqueduct was opened to great fanfare. It was the biggest urban water diversion project anywhere in the world since Augustinian Rome. The aqueduct meant a new beginning, an era of abundant, cholera-free clean water, an era of fountains, an era of flushing toilets and sanitizing baths. Well, for the rich anyway. New York became a magnet for opportunity, sucking the world's economy into its orbit. More docks were built for more boats to bring more things in order to make more things, in order to sell more things, and ship more things in order to make more money. It just kept growing and growing and growing. One thing, however, amidst this velocity of growth, was indeed not growing, and the city was taking notice. Crime and opportunism abounded in this era. In the Fifth Ward, hungry and hopeless Irish men were mostly left behind in the frenzy of opportunity. Their desperation often devolved into opportunistic scrounging, even among the morally minded. Many stole food or robbed pedestrians at knife point. Then there were the cunning criminals of no conscience. They gambled in every tavern, in every back room, where men fought and organized brawls, while other men placed bets. And if men weren't keen to fight each other, they fought chickens against each other. They fought dogs, even rats. There were burglars and pickpockets. There were con artists and extortionists and kidnappers. There were ghouls, sneak thieves, river pirates and murderers and arsonists and saboteurs. Packages were routinely stolen from boats docked at night and on sale in the 5 Points the next morning. Orphan children were often manipulated to sneak around on rooftops, climb into windows, and pilfer hidden valuables, earning the respect of the elder criminals, if not themselves robbed of their keep. Every new avenue for growth in New York brought with it an opportunity to hack the system, and there was no shortage of people looking for the next score. Despite the proliferation of crime and thievery, the city had no organized police force. Since the 1600s, in the New Amsterdam days, the city relied on a night watch system. Known as the Rattle Watch, these were guards who sat awake at night in shifts in sentry boxes with a green lantern, a set of keys, and a wooden rattle, which functioned as a primitive alarm. The first sentry box of this nature was located, unsurprisingly, on Wall Street, on the very same corner where the stock exchange sits today. Some of these rattle guards had even been criminals themselves, forced into the position as penance. Some were just men looking for an honest night of work in exchange for a quick buck. The criminals that night watchmen caught in the act were subsequently punished in public humiliation rituals, often stripped and headlocked in a stockade, where the public were invited to laugh and taunt and throw rotten vegetables at the offenders. The night watch system was made an official role by 1734 in British colonial New York, known colloquially as leatherheads for their distinctive headwear, similar in design to modern firemen's helmets. They strolled up and down the city's merchant district with a rattle at the ready and their distinctive green lantern as a forewarning of their presence, and a wooden staff slung over their shoulder like a hobo. Occasionally, these men would either be asleep or drunk on the job. The wealthiest merchants hired private guards to patrol their bucolic enclaves, but the rest of the public, they were on their own. In the provincial days, this system sufficed, but by the 1840s, the night watch system was woefully outdated and undermanned. And with the rising tide of New York's unmanaged population, they could easily be ambushed, extorted, kidnapped, bribed, or bludgeoned. And as New York emerged from a local provincial economy to the new nation's foremost hub for trade with the established world, order would have to be enforced and advanced through executive administration. The very fate of the city's standing in the world depended on it. Prior to 1844 and the resolution to form an official police force, there were a mere 100 marshals, 30 constables, and 50 municipal patrolmen in a city whose population had increased from 80,000 to over 300,000 in under 20 years. Under Mayor William Havemeyer in 1844, the night watch system was officially abolished, and policing as we know it was born. They were known as the Municipal Police, or Munis. They were conceived at the state level with the cooperation of city officials, among them the esteemed railroad tech pioneer Peter Cooper, who drew up the first proposals for conduct, uniforms, ranks, and file. At first, 800 were contracted to one-year terms, and at the end of each term, an officer, based on his conduct, would be expected to reapply. There were no pensions. There were no award ceremonies. There was no official police academy, nor formal training. They were acquired by way of familial connections or past military service. If a police force was to be assembled and imposed, the majority of people, despite the rise in crime, were by and large opposed to it. Many recalcitrant businessmen still harbored the anti-British sentiments of their revolutionary grandparents and resented the adoption of a civic environment resembling colonial-era British New York, where a police force meant nothing more to them than an oppressive military occupation. America was the land of the free, after all, and justice ought to be left to the streets themselves, and not some administrative tyranny. Even among the 800 enrolled, there were reservations. So to quell the opposition, the initial proposals for the formal blue uniforms were abandoned, and the first officers appeared in plain clothes, so as not to suggest a militarized presence, but an order of civilians for the benefit of civilians. The Munis' only indication of authority in the absence of a uniform was the copper badge pinned beside their left lapels. Locally, they were known as coppers, later shortened to cops. However, by the end of the decade, social tensions had flared. Riots and agitations had become more frequent. The Astor Place riot, which is a story for another day, was the final straw. Over 40 were killed and 30 wounded when the militia was summoned to assist the Munis in quelling the disturbance. Thereafter, police not only wore uniforms, but were to be trained in tactics of crowd control. The city was at a crossroads. An order would have to be adopted, no matter the opposition. The Irish, too, were at a political crossroads. Fight the power or seize the opportunity to become the power. The Irish, who instigated the Astor Place riot, were a scarcely regarded labor force with virtually no political power outside their ability to organize into gangs. Their gangs often assembled in their own churches and held meetings therein. By the 1840s, these gangs had not only grown in size and in power, but in tenacity and aspiration. In those days, gangs functioned the way labor unions or community organizers might today, providing everything from food and protection to settling disputes. They were their own little satellite governments. And when cheap labor exceeds demand and education in short supply, gang leaders were representatives of their members' utmost needs, brokering mutually beneficial deals. In the 1810s and 20s, the Irish were a labor force that were cheap, expendable, and uneducated. They built the Erie Canal at minimal cost. Their labor had been in demand, and their fitness to work gave the strongest a competitive edge. But that's all they were, cheap labor. They owned no property, and therefore no voting rights. And with no education nor upward mobility, they posed little threat to the political and economic structures of a Protestant-controlled city. However, by the end of the 1820s, New York state government removed property ownership as a precondition for the vote. And so long as you were naturalized and male and white, you now had the right to vote. And for the first time, poor Catholic men were enfranchised. However, the mayor of New York was at this time still a state-appointed position, and not an elected one, and only the Common Council was made up of elected officials, chosen by districts, known then as wards, and the Irish were a majority in only one ward, the 5th. The Irish, though plentiful, were by no means a majority, and still represented no true political threat to the Protestant dominion over the polls and marketplace. That changed, however, in 1834, when the state legislature approved an amendment to the state constitution that the mayor of New York be elected by majority vote. So, by the 1840s, amidst the adoption of the municipal police force, there was at the same time a political storm brewing. If Irish Catholic enfranchisement signaled a brewing political storm, then 1845 was the touchdown of a tornado. That year, amidst a terrible famine in Ireland, thousands upon thousands upon thousands more Irish began pouring into New York's harbor. Off of every boat stepped an emaciated man, his coughing children, and his fevered wife. They arrived on the return journeys of boats that shipped slave-picked cotton to England from the American South. The Irish were packed into these boats, stacked atop one another like cordwood to give ballast. Boats were often overfilled, as it was fairly assumed that many would die on the trip across the ocean. Often these boats arrived in New York's harbor significantly lighter than when they left port. They were grimly known throughout the city's underclasses as coffin ships. Dressed in sweat-soaked dirty rags, the Irish disappeared into the city unattended. Many slept in the streets, stole, begged, and fought amongst themselves. These were not the fit laborers of the last generation. They were underweight subsistence farmers who had barely eaten in 3 years. They were desperate, with few marketable skills. The nativist gangs cursed their names in the streets, pelted them with rocks and rotten vegetables, screaming from soapboxes for laws prohibiting any more from entering. Nativist leaders saw them as a humanitarian burden upon the city, the growth of which they would impede, not serve. But others looked at them and saw the future threads of New York's political fabric. Nativist gangs would in turn promote narratives that the Irish could not even be classified as white, and thus should not be entitled the right to vote, and would loiter outside the polls on election days, thwarting at every turn the aspirations of the Irish to choose their leaders. By 1850, the population of New York had reached nearly 600,000. Almost 30% of the city was now Irish, and still, more were arriving. The Fifth Ward is where the majority of violent crime took place. Known as the 5 Points, it had become during this time a true ghetto, expanding in population, but not in accommodations. Comprised principally of Irish and free black men, it was also home to expatriated criminals and transients. It was run by slumlords whose properties lacked even the most basic amenities, like ventilation and sealed roofs, as no laws yet required them, despite rampant disease. The inability of the Irish to ascend from poverty was by design, and no amount of hours worked nor effort expended seemed to afford an Irishman a ticket out of the ghetto. But one astute real estate investor turned politician saw an opportunity, and that man was Fernando Wood. Born in Philadelphia in 1812, Fernando Wood amassed his wealth in New York, first as a merchant, then as a real estate investor, by the age of just 22. Thereafter, he graduated into politics as a Democrat, and after the splitting of the Democratic Party, emerged as the leader of Tammany Hall, a political organization which was run more like the mafia than the benevolent order of altruists and empaths it advertised itself to be. Tammany Hall was a fancy title for the executive committee of the Democratic Party of New York. The name Tammany itself was derived from the name Tammany, the wise and virtuous chief of the indigenous Delaware tribe. As America expanded, so too did slavery, the ethics of which was tearing New York apart politically, completely splitting the Democratic Party between soft-shell Democrats, who fully supported newly admitted states to further the institution of slavery, and hard-shell Democrats, who rejected congressional authority to regulate slavery in territories that they didn't represent. Now, while slavery was institutionally illegal in New York, there was scarcely a business in the city without strong economic ties to the southern plantation economy. The people of New York, however, were divided on the issue. The Irish, by and large, resented black people, seeing them as a group that they were ethnically superior to, yet saw themselves as socially inferior to. Now, while it is hard to imagine such sentiments, it must be understood that as the subject of slavery took on great national importance and the plight of black people was elevated to the conscience of every American, the lives of the Irish were disregarded, unimportant, and their circumstances bleak, with thousands unable to find work and no prospects for any future. There were no advocates making impassioned speeches on their behalf, not in Congress, not from the pulpit, nor in the streets. They were on their own. This, among other grievances, was an ever-present source of their resentment. But Fernando Wood saw this aggravation and exploited it to become the highest-profile voice of their disillusionment. A rich man he was, yet he spoke for the poor. Despite living in squalor, the Irish often paid the same rent as other immigrants, yet lived in far worse conditions, as they were unwelcome to live anywhere outside of the 5 Points. They needed direction. They needed clean air and streets and space to breathe. They needed status and a ticket out of the ghetto. They needed hope. Fernando Wood offered this hope and made promises in abundance, and routinely stoked their resentment of free black men. Fernando Wood was an outspoken supporter of slavery and the populist Young America movement that advocated manifest destiny and an industrial expansion that promoted jobs. He was soon ordained by Tammany Hall to run for mayor. But after a landslide loss to the Whig candidate, oil merchant Ambrose Kingsland, Tammany backers found him instead a job as a congressman, where he picked up legitimacy and advanced the Tammany cause. Soon after the Kansas-Nebraska Act, however, the Whig Party all but collapsed, opening up New York to populist euphoria and reunifying the Democratic Party to finally secure him a term as mayor by 1854. By now, the population of New York was nearing 1 million. This feat was achieved in part by lobbying the Irish 5 Points gangs to go out and coerce the vote. Promises had been made from Wood's campaign to ascend these gang leaders to official positions, and gang members mobilized to ensure this victory. Wood promised shovel-ready jobs for a new, much-talked-about project uptown, building a massive park right in the center of the island, a park that would be as much a right for the working classes to enjoy as it would be for the rich. And he promised that he would not employ a single free black man to take a single job away from a deserving Irishman. During the election, Irish gangsters followed the public into voting booths, protecting them from the intimidation of nativist gangs. Men with beards voted and were coerced to shave and go vote again. For those aloof or preoccupied, Irish gangsters kidnapped men off the streets and brought them to the polling stations, having plied them with alcohol and empty promises of returned favors. Needless to say, Fernando Wood won the election. Upon taking office, Wood wasted no time and immediately rejected the state-ordered municipal police force on constitutional grounds that the state government not have authority over the city's conduct. Wood ordered the Common Council to dismiss the police board of directors, and he would have the authority to appoint his own. Wood defiantly assembled his own little army, led by party loyalists and benefactors of his choosing, of which he, and not the governor, would have command. His most ardent 5 Points foot soldiers were handed badges. It was that simple. When the New York Times accused him of corrupt hiring practices, Wood enlisted and promoted several former Whigs up the ranks to show bipartisanship. To ingratiate himself to the new municipal police force, he elevated their stature by organizing the first ever award ceremonies for officers who showed bravery and excellence in service, conducted in displays of great fanfare. The awards were silver. He paid for them himself out of pocket, without a dollar coming from Albany. In 1856, he ran for re-election, and this time, when gangsters coerced people into the voting booths, they wore blue uniforms with copper badges. Over the next year, the police had become so corrupt, so unchallenged, that they scarcely felt compelled to even hide it. Rumors spread of misconduct across the city, then across the state. Police officer Mastel was even rumored to have taken bribes from the underworld's lowest criminals, including the universally reviled abortionist Madame Rastel. Policemen were even known to secretly snatch up free black men off the streets and sell them into slavery. Those who knew of it did not complain. By 1857, the political winds were blowing in a new direction, and a new party had risen like a phoenix from the ashes of the vanquished Whigs. The Republicans. And they were growing ever more radical as unrest ravaged Kansas out west. Governor John A. King was one of these Republicans. He took office in 1857. Formerly a Whig, he was the son of famed founding father and patriot Rufus King, who in addition to serving in Congress is best known for signing the Constitution. In the political sense, John King was born on third base, but used his authority to further the true message of the Constitution, to expand the rights of man. He was a staunch opponent of slavery and vehemently opposed the Fugitive Slave Act during his own stint in Congress back in 1850. Governor John King despised Tammany Hall for all of its corruptions and self-serving games they played at the expense of the working poor, whose tax dollars were quickly becoming their pillow stuffings. Upon taking office, he seized the opportunity to organize a new police force at the state level and quickly dispatched them to override and overrule Wood's appointed munis. This new force would be known as the Metropolitan Police, known among New Yorkers as the Mets. But when this new force entered the city, they spent more time thwarting the munis' policing than they did stopping street crime. Each police force considered the other to be an illegal entity, with no legitimacy, jurisdiction, nor rights to position. News of this dispute spread like a plague. Municipal police were no longer being obeyed by the public. Arrested offenders would simply be let out of jail by the Metropolitans, who declared the arrest unlawful. This sent the city into a pre-civilizational frenzy. Criminals declared open season and danced in the streets for several days, openly flaunting their crimes. As in the power vacuum, many denied the legitimacy of either authority. In June of 1857, things finally boiled over. Inconveniently amidst this fiasco, the Wood-appointed street commissioner had died, and Governor John A. King appointed a new one, Daniel Conover, to go to New York and assume the office. But upon arrival at City Hall on June the 16th, he found the vacancy had already been filled by one Charles Devlin, who had paid good money, some $50,000, $1.5 million in today's money, for the position. Appalled at the revelation, Conover demanded Devlin's resignation, but Conover was swiftly apprehended by the guarding municipal police, and at the order of Mayor Wood, clenched and dragged down the corridors of City Hall, and forcibly evicted, tossed to the steps like a disorderly drunk. Conover collected himself and dashed off to telegraph Albany, quickly receiving 2 warrants for the arrest of the mayor on grounds of assault and inciting a riot. Mayor Wood, knowing the Mets would soon arrive, summoned additional support, and 300 munis were soon by his side at City Hall, awaiting further instructions. Shortly thereafter, Captain George Walling of the Mets was dispatched to City Hall, but arrived alone to formally serve the warrant and escort the mayor to be booked. A tense argument ensued, and Mayor Wood refused the order, prompting Walling to initiate a forceful arrest, pleading with the municipals on hand to recognize his authority and heed his commands. But the loyal municipals did not comply with Walling's order. Wood, in turn, demanded they apprehend and remove Walling. A scuffle ensued, and Walling, unattended by his own patrolmen, was, too, dragged from the mayor's office, down the corridors of City Hall, and tossed to the steps in a dishonorable fashion. The doors clapped shut behind him. Walling arose, fixed himself, climbed back up the steps to hammer the doors with his fists, shouting vehemently. An order was sent to send a reinforcement of Metropolitan Police to assist and enforce this arrest, and within minutes, 50 Metropolitan officers were arriving at the scene with batons ready. From the windows of City Hall, the municipals witnessed this assembly, and in short order the doors were dashed open, and all 300 municipals charged out and down the stairs as the Mets charged toward them. Shouting and cursing and swinging and punching, the rival police forces were in a full-blown bloodletting brawl. Some Metropolitans managed to swing and kick their way fully up the stairs and beyond the doors of City Hall, where the mayor hid defiantly in his office. The fighting raged for over half an hour before adrenaline gave way to drowsy, and the outmanned Metropolitans were purged from the premises in a disorganized defeat. The majority of them were seriously wounded. One patrolman of the 17th Precinct even suffered injuries so severe that he was rendered disabled for life. As Metropolitans retreated and sought medical attention, Mayor Wood and his municipal cohorts cheered and celebrated in the mayor's office and sang throughout the halls. But this celebration was short-lived. Appalled at the travesty, Daniel Conover had telegraphed his lawyer, who came to him, and the two of them went off to convince the sheriff that the power of the state government would come down on him if he did not assist in carrying out these warrants. The sheriff agreed, but he too was escorted from City Hall. The Metropolitan Police Board had seen enough. They summoned Major General Charles Sanford, who agreed to march the 7th Regiment fully armed to City Hall, which they did by late that afternoon, surrounding the building. At last, outnumbered, Mayor Wood conceded, ordered his forces to stand down, and was placed under arrest in his own office and led from City Hall in restraints. Within an hour, Mayor Wood was free on bail, and civil courts would later rule that the governor had no legal authority to override the mayor's appointments of city officials. And for the entirety of that summer of 1857, a civil war among police forces persisted, with each force interfering in the business of the other. And crime proliferated on every block, with little consequence. By the end of the summer, the Court of Appeals ruled in favor of the governor, and this time Mayor Wood, whose antics were now the daily sufferings of the city, agreed to disband the municipal police force, and the Mets were declared the official force of the city. Captain George Whaling would later go on to be the chief of police by the 1870s. And Wood, after leaving office, would go on to serve in the House of Representatives for several years and become nationally famous as the most defiant voice against the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. The injured officers that fall sued Mayor Wood for damages and won, but Fernando Wood never paid. It was the taxpayers that footed the bill. So there you have it, the police riots of 1857. I told you it was a weird story. Now, if you liked what you saw, or maybe you've just got some feedback on how to, chop it up more or whatever, get involved. Again, you're the ones who have influence over the direction of creators. It's a democratic platform. And hey, I've been on this planet for 42 years. If you got some nasty thing to say, I can handle it. But be civil with one another, okay? We could use a little bit of civility. If anything, that's the whole point of the story. Yeah, I've gone on too long. Again, please, take care. See you in the next one.